Oh, loads of people all at once. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our final installment of the Tapestry series. Good to see so many people joining. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what you're hoping to get out of the conversation today. Hi, everyone. Hey, Paula. Hey, Roxana. Good to see you joining on the call. Hi, Sophia. Welcome. And Joanna, Women Moving Millions in North Carolina, and Fair Share. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in a couple of minutes. We're just letting everyone kind of jump in. Hi, Jamie. Good to see you on the call, and Nancy as well. Nordine. Amazing. So nice to see so many different voices joining us today. Hopefully we'll have some time to get it stuck into some questions. Lauren, do you think we're ready to get going?
Yeah, I think we can pop off. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Very excited to see so many faces, and we'll let people continue to introduce themselves as they are joining. I will introduce myself. I'm Leanne Levos. I am the Director of Advocacy and Communications at Global Office and one of the team members of Women in Dev. And welcome to our Tapestry series, which really seeks to dive into various areas of development and see how gender cuts across some of those areas. So for those of you who don't know, we have done 5 of these, or this is the 5th one, and we've covered everything from global health to climate change, racial justice, feminist organizing, and today, as you know, we are covering feminist funding. And I'm really, really excited to have a great group of people on the call today who are going to delve into really talking about feminist funding and what's happening on the scene, where the gaps are, what's changing, what's shifting, what they'd like to see more of, talk a little bit about their own work and how they're changing the space and moving the dial forward. So really excited to hear from them. And also we have Erica with us from ThinkLink. Is that the right name, Lauren? Yeah, ThinkLink, who will be giving us a visual of what the conversation is holding. And Erica's been doing this across all of our conversations. And so what we're hoping is that we'll have one big tapestry, hence the name Tapestry series, that will show the intersections across the different sectors that we've been covering, and really show the scope for where the gaps are, the scope for collaboration, the scope for further growth, the scope for networking. And so really excited to have her on. Thank you, Erica, for doing this and for taking us along this visual journey. And yeah, so we'll get really stuck into it. I mean, today we're talking about the money, right? We're talking about how it flows, where it's going, who's missing it, who's getting it. And we're going to start by just doing a quick round of introductions with all of our amazing panelists. And so I would like to start off with Alfonsina. If Alfonsina, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Alfonsina Peñaloza. I'm the program director for Global and Latin America programs at Co-Impact, and delighted to be here and jump into this sticky but really important topic.
Amazing. And Jabilsile, am I doing it right? Am I saying it right?
Almost.
I'll get there.
It's all right. My name is Jabilsile Tugwana. I work for the Black Feminist Fund as a resource mobilization manager. I identify as a Black queer feminist, and my politics are grounded in the fact that I am South African and I'm the granddaughter of 2 domestic workers. My background is in social sciences, and I have been laboring for social justice for all of my my working life, which is almost 2 decades. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Jess.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Tomlin, and I'm so happy to be here as well in conversation with you all on my favorite thing, how to fund feminist movements abundantly at scale in perpetuity. That's my jam. So I'm really excited to be here along with my esteemed panelists, and thanks Women in Dev for inviting me. I am a Canadian born and raised, currently living in San Francisco temporarily, and driving a quality fund over this design and build phase over the next couple of years as we stand up what we hope will be $1 billion of impact for feminist movements globally.
Amazing. All of these introductions are so exciting. And Joy, just wrap up for us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Chia. I'm the executive director of Astraea Lesbian Foundation for Justice. I am wearing multiple hats in our conversation. I'm also here to represent the Prospera International Network of Women's Funds, of which I am a board member. And I'm very excited to be here. I mean, I know we all give our life stories, but I'm born and raised in Singapore. I'm calling you all from New York City. And I guess part of the work that I do is really bridging across movements, bridging across cultures, across languages, around concepts, ideas, but also, working really closely about how those of us as emergents can be centered in some of the decisions that really impact our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Joy. And really looking to hear how you manage both hats and make contributions on both sides. Sounds like a mammoth of work, but yes. All of us are here because we're really dedicated to the feminist movement and empowering women and individuals and across development. And so I'm really excited to hear how everybody's contributing to that. And really what we'd like to do today is take everyone along a journey of the funding pipeline, as it were. So figure out where the money is sitting, what efforts and work are being done to mobilize and unlock the funding, the institutions, the foundations, the mechanisms through which the money is being dispersed, and the work that's being done to ensure that the money is actually getting to the people who need it, to making sure that women are actually receiving money on the ground and in a way that allows them to deliver long-term change. We've said this before, but so many of us are at the forefront of this work, but also making sure that women who are also the most vulnerable to so many situations are receiving the money and doing the work and being cared for and taken and appreciated at the same time. So of course, we know that everyone on this call knows that there are huge challenges. There are big gaps where money is getting diverted along the way, and there are blockages that activists and advocates have to spend a lot of time and energy and resources to persuade people and convince them that this is where the money should be going, and redirect that money. But there's also, I hope to hear that there is significant progress being made along the way. And so I'd love to hear more. Let's start with Jess. You've done a lot of work in this area, and would love to hear you talk a little bit more about what Equality Fund is doing and what you've managed to achieve with your partners, and what's just been your experience in this work, and what have you been your biggest wins and then also your biggest challenges.
Leanne, thanks so much. I'm happy to take on that question. And maybe I'll start with a quick overview of Equality Fund so folks on the call can up speed on what we've done and what we're trying to do. And there are no challenges whatsoever in standing this baby up. So we can just skip that part. No kidding. I know we all want to get into those details, but Equality Fund was born out of a government policy in Canada called the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which was a very intentional direction and shift in policy by the Canadian government to move development money in more feminist ways. This is accompanied by a feminist foreign policy that's currently in the works and a number of other things that have moved, parity in cabinet, childcare, national childcare program, et cetera. So it was part of a suite of progressive policies that our international assistance policy should move in this direction. The feminists in Canada and globally really did a ton of advocacy around how policy meets practice and what that means in terms of how money needs to flow differently. And what was birthed out of that was the Equality Fund, fundamentally, which was a one-time initial $300 million contribution that would serve to sort of seed, de-risk, and unlock additional capital to fund feminist movements in perpetuity. So with that contribution from the Government of Canada, the Equality Fund is standing itself up and fundraising and mobilizing resources alongside that initial investment in new and different places in order to fundamentally get to what we hope will be over $1 billion that will fund feminist movements globally over time, recognizing that what we would like to be doing is to be funding these organizations, supporting, working alongside them in decades, not project cycles. So that's what we're doing. And we are in the midst of doing this. We laugh sometimes because we actually received the contribution, which I believe is the largest ever by any government in the history of time to feminist movements. So we take that responsibility very, very seriously. But we joke at the office because we got the check, so to speak, a week before COVID hit. So we have been standing up the Equality Fund in the context of a global pandemic, which has been challenging. But we're here for it. We will talk about this, I think, throughout the call today, but fundamentally what we're trying to do, if you can think about it in two different sides. So one is we're trying to bring net new money, net new partnerships, net new conversations to the table to move folks who currently don't fund in this way to start funding in this way, leveraging potentially the partnership that we have with the Government of Canada and other governments, as well as key philanthropic allies, to really think differently about how to move that money. One of the other areas that we are building is an impact investing portfolio. So what we did not want to do at Equality Fund was put $300 million under the mattress. What we also did not want, and wait for us to need it, what we also wanted to do was recognize that amount of money gave us a new platform for new conversations. And so we're trying to leverage that platform to influence investors to better align their investments through a feminist lens. So we have built a platform and a strategy and a portfolio that we built it from scratch. And whilst we are building up our grant making and building up the Equality Fund, we are also building up what is now the largest gender lens impact investing portfolio in the world. And the reason we wish to do that is because we recognize the harm that can be caused in the investment ecosystem. And we don't want to try to undo the harm with our philanthropy money or with the money that we're moving out through grants that is being created in capital markets, because that is just us, chasing our tail, so to speak. And so what we are trying to do is move all money in all ways towards a North Star of gender equality. So just that, we're just doing that. We're doing a few things at the Equality Fund. And I'm just really proud of the team and where we've come from. We are building ourselves up from the ground up, which has its challenges and its opportunities. So we're not trying to make an organization more feminist. We are a feminist organization that's building itself from scratch. So that has meant all sorts of things in terms of how we stand ourselves up. But what it has afforded us is the opportunity to move money in deeply feminist ways. We fund an ecosystem approach, so we support local community organizations. We reach even smaller organizations potentially through through one of our grant making streams, which supports exclusively feminist funds and women's funds. And we are currently designing a stream of funding to support women and feminist organizations in crisis. And we defined crisis quite broadly, recognizing that these organizations are oftentimes first responders and at the front lines, and very, very rarely, if ever, or I would say, totally boxed out of the humanitarian system. And so we are building out these design streams, and we're 2.5 years in, and we have been able to move $50 million into the hands of these organizations over that time. So we've had a few wins, I would say. We've done what we've said we can do, and what I would say has been most powerful is having these unlikely partnerships between philanthropy and government partners has meant that we are bringing new conversations and new funders to the table, bringing them in, and the timing is good because there's a real shift in international development consciousness. And so I believe the progressive government partners in particular, as well as philanthropy partners, and I know my colleagues will speak to this as well, wish to be on the right side of this change that's really happening around localization and decolonization and any number of things. So I don't know how I am for time, Leanne. I can maybe pause it here. I've got lots more I can say about challenges, but I can also weave that into my next time you call on me. I don't want to take up too much time.
No, thank you. That was a great starting point, Jess. And I mean, I think the interesting thing, I mean, historically, there's been a lot of difficulty in terms of getting bilateral funding at scale in the way that you've been able to do it. So it's very interesting to hear that this is an angle that has worked and you've managed to achieve so much during the pandemic and in such a short period of time. So thank you for starting us off. And it's a really nice transition actually to you, Alfonsina, because your approach is slightly different. Co-Impact is a donor collaborative fund that's been unlocking money through philanthropy, I think more specifically. And you have a very interesting approach in terms of how you work closely with program partners and finding solutions collaboratively, and have a dedicated kind of resource for gender equality. So if you could talk us through kind of the approach that Co-Impact takes and how different that is from what Jess has just mentioned, and how you see yourself or the organization within kind of the wider funding ecosystem.
Thank you, Leanne. And I can't start without saying that I really think that what the Equality Fund has been able to do has just been such a beacon of hope for feminists everywhere. We're so elated in the celebration that we had when it was announced that the Equality Fund had received the Canadian sort of money, that it really is, I think, proof of what can be done. And I think more collaboration and more support needs to happen so that more money gets spent in different ways. So you mentioned, Leanne, I think the differences that exist between how the Equality Fund funds and how Co-Impact works in funds. And as you mentioned, we're a donor collaborative, so we're not endowed. We fundraise and we mobilize money, which is often similarly to Jess's point, it's also new money from philanthropists and foundations. And what we fund is scalable gender equality programs in a nutshell. I think by new money, what we mean is that we're often fundraising for groups that weren't previously funding gender. I think this is really important given how underfunded this topic is. It also raises a challenge, which I don't know if we'll have time today, but it's not just about more money, but also how this money needs to be spent. There are many lessons from our colleagues on this call, from the Black Feminist Fund, from Astraea, and from Equality Fund about how to do feminist funding. So it's not just about the money, but we can park that for the next round. So Co-Impact works really closely with program partners. All of our partners are predominantly locally rooted, because we know that those are the people closest to the problems are those who know what the solutions are to those big barriers to gender equality. And we fund systems change. So we're really funding much longer term, flexible funding that allows organizations to really strategize and think about what are some of the root causes for health, economic, and education systems to discriminate against women and historically marginalized groups. What are the laws, the policies, the mechanisms that prevent these groups from accessing the services, from realizing their rights, and from living in equitable and fulfilling lives? And I think how I see our work is to Jess's point, we're all part of an ecosystem, and I see Co-Impact's work as part of a continuum. There are women who organize in response to failures in government systems, and that needs funding. There are those who are finding solutions to address the immediate needs of their communities in light of some of these failures. That also needs funding. There are groups that are innovating and partnering and sort of figuring out how to scale, and that needs funding too. And a lot of this work, seeding organizations, funding activists, funding grassroots organizing and convenings, is work that the feminists and women's funds in this panel do really well. And there's a lot that we can learn from them. The problem is that there's just not enough money coming in to meet the scale of the challenge. All of these different phases of the continuum need funding. And for Co-Impact, we are looking at those sort of proven models that are ready to scale. That's sort of our niche, that's our area. But that's just one of the many needs, which all need funding. All of them, we need to work together. We need to support each other. We need to amplify the work, not only of the ones that we're funding, but of others. And particularly, more importantly, we need to meet the needs of the partners, who are those who are dealing with the problems at the different levels. There's the upstream and the downstream, which is sort of this continuum, right? And all of these different stages of that continuum require funding and require these conversations about how to do so in a responsible and feminist way. I also think that the lack of funding, I need to say this because even though we've been saying this for a really long time, I think it still requires that the lack of funding creates a sort of scarcity environment where even those who are working towards the same goals are pitted as competitors. And this creates, what we need to talk about, and what I think all of the partners on this call really sort of are working towards is creating more of an environment of abundance and thinking about how can we change that mindset, even if it's not yet a reality. How can we come at it from a place of abundance and collaboration, rather than seeing each other as competitors for these funds, which indeed they are still scarce and we need more. But I think if we change that mindset, I think that's one of the challenges that for Co-Impact, and I think for the philanthropy sector, needs to be really talked about and challenged, so that we can find ways of switching that mentality.
Amazing. And just in terms of, you mentioned really quickly, Alfonsina, about the kind of pitting against of groups of each other. And I wanted to kind of delve a little bit deeper into how Co-Impact works with its program partners to disrupt that, really, and to make people feel like they're all part of one larger community that's working together, so that there's a better working relationship between donors, advisors, program partners. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I'll do so briefly, because I think there's a lot more that we need to learn and do more and better. One of the ways in which we do so is we try to support our program partners in their own fundraising. Co-Impact has limited funds, and we also want to ensure that our program partners are sustainable in the long term. And so we help connect them with our own funding partners and with other donors to be able to help them in their fundraising efforts. I think the fact that we're bringing in new money is part of that effort as well. And I think one of the things that we need to be, again, very mindful of, it's not just about bringing in the new money, but also sort of meeting those new funders where they're at and accompanying them along what I think is a long journey of learning what feminist funding can look like and why it needs to look the way that it looks. And last but not least, I think co-funding and collaborating with other feminist funders. I've had the privilege of working with all of the panelists on this call, including yourself, Leanne. I think there's a lot of humility that comes from hearing what other folks are dealing with. There's a lot of incredible lessons that need to be taken into consideration, and there's support. I think we need to support each other. Again, to your point around not being pitted as competitors, it's about getting more money for all of us, because all of us need it, because we're all funding critical parts of the ecosystem. If the parts that the other folks are funding are not funded, the work that co-impact funds can't be successful, and vice versa. The pieces that co-impact funds cannot serve are critical for those other pieces of the continuum. And so I think understanding that as part of all of us as part of an ecosystem rather than just pieces is, I think, the key to be able to sort of turn that paradigm around.
Thank you, Alfonsina. Yeah, I think, as you said, thinking of the entire group of individuals and organizations that are working as part of this larger ecosystem is really important, as opposed to this kind of competitive nature that maybe historically has existed. And Joy, I'm going to switch to you with your Prospera hat on and ask you to speak a little bit more about this ecosystem and how that really informed the work of Prospera. And yeah, just let us know a little bit more.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I think that Jess and Alfonsina have spoken quite deeply about the barriers to mobilization of resources and kind of what we're trying to do in terms of, you said, bringing in new money, but also creating an environment that is enabling for all of us, and also one that is a system of abundance. I think for me, what I want to talk about is around the questions around how our resources are distributed. So we have this question of, so we have mobilized all the resources, and then, what do we do with it? And I think that I want to take a quick step back in time, like overview the factors that affect the ecosystem that we're talking about today. And part of the history of our sector is rooted in organized benevolence, meaning that aid money, development money, philanthropy, charity has history in a structure that has and sometimes, and definitely still does, sees division between those who have and those who don't, and attributes certain characteristics to those people, but also that has long lumped together groups as needing protection. So like women, children, people with disabilities, minority groups. And the impact on our ecosystem here is that there is a real question about, well, how does this protective framework and the histories of how our money comes through affect the way in which we make decisions about money flows, right? So I think that who gets to make decisions about where money flows really matters. And very often the people who are making decisions about where money flows are not the ones who are most impacted. And at the same time, have no possible contextual understanding of what it means to be like allocating resources. The next thing I think that really changes, impacts our ecosystem is that how the money moves also matters, right? So is the money flexible enough to allow us to make shifts in strategies, to seize opportunities when they come, to really move towards what communities and individuals prioritize rather than agendas that are set by somebody else. And I think that this is like the grounding principles for what Prospera members are trying to do individually as women's funds, that many of my colleagues here as feminist funds are also thinking about in terms of, looking at resource flows moving from global north to global south and east, but also within our countries of in terms of wealth and disparities, and recognizing that like there are deep inequalities in terms of access and also the ability to use resources. I think Prospera as an international network is also really in an interesting project because we're a network that believes that we're more than the sum of our parts. Funding work together, showing that we can do different kinds of work, and also making the case for what feminist funding practice is a really important part of this work. And I think that what we've seen in the last 3 years, you know, around certain big events in the world like COVID has proven to be a really critical point for us. Women's funds and feminist funds have demonstrated a unique capacity to reach and provide resources to structurally marginalized activists and organizations. I think what we're seeing is that in the moments where, you know, when you have flexible resources, you can choose to fund the work that keeps your communities alive. And that was a really important work for us at Astraea. And then the other piece here is also like, you know, responding to the war in Ukraine, how as a network, we were able to move resources to our Ukrainian women's funds, but also mobilize resources around other places where they could not able to provide emergency response. So this whole ecosystem, the connections, the ability to coordinate is important, but also difficult because it requires investment in relationships. So that is like one aspect of it. I would say that the last impact of this sort of like history that we're in on the ecosystem is also around how we all categorize ourselves. I think that the way that money flows is very much population oriented and geography oriented. And that's not how we live our lives. And, you know, wearing my Astraea hat, you know, I think one of the practical difficulties that we have is that with the trends over the last few years around increased funding, both for gender equality as well as LGBTQI rights, we are faced with a rather interesting problem in which all of the women's, not all, many women's rights funders consider us to be LGBTQI, and they say, go talk to our colleagues, whereas our LGBTQI colleagues may fund us, but don't really consider and center the experiences of queer and trans women. And so it's an irony because, you know, our origin story around as Lesbian Foundation for Justice is one that, you know, brought together a group of women who are multi-class, multiracial in New York, who were looking at movements that they didn't think were diverse and inclusive enough. And the fund at that time when there was no money, and you could just imagine yourself as being the ones who both had to mobilize and then distribute resources, actually gave them a lot more freedom than what we have now. And so, you know, starting off looking at movements, the leadership of lesbians and women of color, looking at who's marginalized. Now we fund across the globe, not just in the US, not just in New York, but also looking at trans and intersex communities and activism. I think that the founding piece is really a question of like who is missing and how resources reach people who are not at the table, and how do we create the tables for all of us to be at so that resources are distributed in ways that make sense and meet the priorities of the communities that we want to fund. Thanks.
Thank you, Joy. And, you know, all of you have really spoken about the ecosystem, and we've captured some of the challenges of mobilization, but then also, Joy, you pointed to this problem of distribution, and that kind of being a part of this larger issue of who is funding and do they have the contextual knowledge to be able to fund in a way that is responsive to the needs of the communities that are most in need of this funding. And I think this is a really nice segue for Black Feminist Fund Jabilsile to talk about the work of Black Feminist Fund and the way in which you're really doing some amazing work to fill the gap in funding Black feminist organizations and Black feminists in general. I recently saw the open call letter, which I was really excited to see, and would love to hear about the work of BFF in general, but also how that has been kind of, how the response to that open call has been, and just sharing a little bit more about the work that you've been doing and some of the challenges that you've faced as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I do think that it's important coming into this call to not take for granted that everyone knows who or what the Black Feminist Fund is. So I do want to share a little bit about that, and also to just frame it in really like a simple way. So fundamentally, right, I think the case has been set really well in relation to where the funding gaps are. But what the Black Feminist Fund is doing is problematizing that to surface the fact that Black feminist movements simply do not have access to the resources that they need in order to make the change that is needed, right? And that is at the core of why we exist. And the ways in which we do this are quite deliberate. So we do this, first of all, obviously, by giving the resources to Black feminist movements in ways that are substantial. So this isn't an exercise in giving crumbs, right? So this is an exercise in resourcing Black feminist movements to be able to grow and also to be able to sustain themselves. Because I think part of the problem with the ecosystem is to fund in ways that are project-based or that create so many barriers, like, for example, in terms of reporting, which prevents movements from doing the real work, which is the world building, right? Which is the creating of alternatives. And so that is our contribution. And then in addition to that, the work that we're doing is also within philanthropy. And I think that's what the open letter demonstrates. So the open letter that you're referring to, for those who are not aware, was launched last week on the 26th of January. It was co-authored by 11 of our funders. And so it is a letter that is a call to the philanthropic sector to really resource Black feminist movements like we want them to win. And we've had amazing response to that from, the pickup of it in terms of media visibility, but also from people in the philanthropic sector who want to sign on and want to be part of the change that we want to create. In addition to that, what I think has been interesting about the letter is that movements themselves have seen the letter as a tool that they can use to hold their own donors accountable for not doing enough or not doing anything, right, to support Black feminist movement building. And then on the question about the money, right, I think the conversation has been quite rich, but I do think that we need to remind ourselves of the fundamentals, right? Like, the reason that we're facing these problems isn't because the money is not there, right? The money is there. And we know this because, like, I'm sure many people on the call are aware of a recent report that basically showed that anti-rights movements have been funded up to $2 billion, right? We're also aware of illicit financial flow. So the money is there, right? So that's definitely not the problem. I also think that the problem isn't that there's insufficient evidence to the need, right? We know that the need is there. Even as a Black Feminist Fund, we have research that shows that less than 0.5% of Black feminist movements have received foundation funding globally, which is outrageous, right? And so I really think that what we are offering as a Black Feminist Fund is like a new practice that is grounded in trust, that privileges the experiences of the movements that we are working with. And we've done this by having two streams of funding. So we have our Solidarity Fund, which runs on a rolling basis, and then we also have our Sustain Fund. And so the Sustain Fund basically, and we're really excited because we have just finalized our grantees. So we have over 20 grantees that we'll be journeying with for the next 8 years, right? And that is like unprecedented. And in doing that, we see ourselves as disrupting harmful philanthropic practices, right? We're doing that, first of all, by providing these substantial grants, but also not offering them in ways that restrict movements to have to respond to like some particular theme, right? Because Black feminist movement building is fundamentally intersectional, right? So I think it's important to recognize that and create space for that. So I'm going to pause here, but that's it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Joy, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to the points that Jabilsile was making about, you know, the lack of funding that is directed towards vulnerable communities. And I'm wondering from an LGBTQI standpoint about getting funding from gender pots or gender equality pots. And is there a difficulty? Is there an overlap? And yeah, if you can just walk us through that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think that you've sort of like placed the structure, right? That the structure is there, that there are certain budget lines that flow in the way, well, no, let me take a step back. Let me just kind of explain. So Astraea has grown quite significantly in the last decade or so, in part because of bilateral interest in supporting feminist movements and LGBTQI movements. However, the people who are making decisions about those things see those two as separate populations and don't also have a clear understanding about how the lives of LGBTQ women are often invisibilized within these sectors as well. And so therefore, to your point, to your kind of the question, this is not something that's just about LGBTQI women. I mean, it's also about women with disabilities, Indigenous women, Black women, Afro-Descendant women. I mean, like all of these pieces, right? The fact that our models of resource from the governments, from big institutional places, are structured such that it's primarily run by white cis men who do not experience most means that in a very practical terms, the money flows on an Excel spreadsheet don't take into account for all of these messiness of our lives. And so that is, to me, kind of like the fundamental question. You know, minority populations get put under human rights, and then and it's interesting, like the ministries of foreign affairs may have a human rights pot, and then which is further divided into civil and political rights, like all the other people have, and then we have a small pot for all of the people who are different. And then it's another stream of pot that's for called gender equality or gender, but primarily focused on women and girls, and maybe in a different perspective on how that would work. So even in the context of it, right? I mean, like I wrote to myself maybe 10 years ago, kind of as I was thinking about my strategy for grant making, like, are women's rights human rights? Because if they are, why do we have different pots of money for them? And I think that's the fundamental question that is being raised by all of this. And I think that then basically what the Black Feminist Fund is trying to do is really kind of both problematize but operationalize what it means to be working at the intersection of these identities, and the same for us at Astraea, recognizing that, you know, it is actually very difficult because the world that we see, that we're looking at, is not one that's like primarily factored based on who we sleep with or like what's between our legs. Like the world that we live in is much more complex, and our vision is much more complex, but our priority is with LGBTQI communities. So you're seeing my internal complex questions as we deal with this as an organization.
No, and I completely hear what you're saying and agree with you. You know, we do live we all have, there's a lot of messiness, and that's okay. And that messiness shouldn't be dissected and funded in that, you know, in a way that is divisive. And I think you explained that quite well. And, you know, as part of Equality Fund and Co-Impact, Jess and Alfonsina, I'm wondering, how you respond to some of those issues. And maybe just if you want to start off talking about what are the challenges that you face in convincing big donors to give in a more comprehensive way. You know, obviously, as I said before, you've been able to mobilize a lot of bilateral funding, and, you know, how have you been able to do that? And then Alfonsina, you know, again, how is it with the work of, you mentioned collaborating with other funds as well, and just talking a little bit about how we continue to collaborate and how that informs the way co-impact funds in order to meet the messy lives that women have. So Jess, I'll ask you to go first, and then Alfonsina, you can just go straight into afterwards.
Yeah, I so much of what's being said really resonates. I think equally, maybe I think Alfonsina can probably speak to the philanthropic ecosystem and maybe what, just so that we've got different perspectives. I would say in the government system, I mean, we live in a really racist world. We live in a world that has been deeply impacted by colonization. We live in the patriarchy. So to assume that any of these systems don't play out in how we negotiate agreements or how agreements are shaped with government partners, unfortunately, is naive on our part. We continue to push, but I would say that there is progressive political will, and that's worth its weight in gold. And then there's the back end. It's the way contracts are constructed. It's the way in which people understand what accountability to the taxpayer looks like. It is deeply lacking in trust. It has I would say there's a very different sense of risk and how that's calculated. So actually, as unsexy perhaps as it seems, a lot of the work that we're trying to do at Equality Fund is have those conversations with our government partners to kind of, again, to the point I think Alfonsina made, like bring them along in some of this work and negotiate and have conversations and build new ways of working alongside one another that meet folks in the middle. You know, we see it as part of our work to do that. We also see it as our part of our work to, like, at the financial level, contractual level, legal level, like a lot of that work, we have a whole team that is trying to do some of that work and negotiation. And I think it's absolutely essential, because unless those systems actually change in terms of the dynamics of the money, the way in which money has to move, the way in which it has to be accountable or reported to, the requirements of the grantee back to the government partner, unless that actually shifts, then the money isn't what we need it to be. So I know it's not a particularly dynamic point, but I think it's important to make it like there is a lot of work, I think, that we're all trying to do in our different ways to make the money work for movements. And we don't probably, as women's funds or as feminist funders, we don't talk about that enough. And I just wish to, like, one up for the finance people who do that sort of day in, day out. I would say one of our biggest political strategies is to bring in peer groups. So one of the things that we have had some success doing is actually asking Canada to take leadership in bringing other governments to the table around funding feminist movements. We saw this and using the spaces that they know and where they operate to have these kinds of conversations, whether that was the Generation Equality Forum or more recently, something that we've been really proud of to support the standing up is the Alliance for Feminist Movements. So this is a multi-dimensional platform with government partners, philanthropic partners, civil society organizations, women's funds, and they've all agreed to come together to sign on, to move new money, and to agree on what it actually means to fund feminist movements. And for us, that's a strategy to build accountability amongst a peer group that otherwise has not particularly been robust in this space or frankly accountable. And so the more and more we see ourselves doing that work, whether that's advocating for better financial measurements and contract solutions, or whether that's building broader, bigger platforms for peer funders and bringing the accountability that way. I think there's a multitude of different strategies that we're trying to employ to shift hearts and minds. I think there's not one person, Leanne, on this call who would say like, oh, we haven't made this case well enough, or like, I think we're pretty tired of it, actually. That there's the reason that we can, the money is absolutely there. It absolutely is there. We have seen over the last 10 years, money in humanitarian funding, 2.2% is going to feminist organizations and women's rights organizations. That number hasn't shifted in a decade, right? And we're just constantly seeing that. So I'm frustrated. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel are frustrated. It isn't that the case hasn't been made properly. It isn't that there isn't enough money. It's the systems that we're operating in, right? So the more that we can work within those systems and move those systems, I think the more we can actually move more and better money. But that's the work,
Well, that's a tough act to follow, because I think Jess just summed it up so well. The gender fund at Co-Impact is new. We've only done one round of funding. So there's a lot that we still need to learn, but there's also been some good lessons that Co-Impact has had, some things that I think we've gotten right almost from the beginning, I'd like to say, and some things that we've learned from the feminist community. And I think there's two. I loved Joy's sort of distinction between sort of the collecting of funds, or the fundraising, and then the distribution of them. I think on the distribution side, Co-Impact, there's some things that it's gotten right. We fund locally, so we're trying to break this trend in philanthropy of funding organizations and work in the global north that takes place in the global south. We fund directly in country, and over 75% of our grants are given to women-led organizations. And of course, there's much more nuance and intersectionality there that we need to keep in account, but I think that's something that Co-Impact has gotten right. To Jess's point around sort of the back end pieces, we try to be as program partner centric as possible. We've learned a lot about what some of the onerous processes of just receiving a grant are, reporting, and all of those sort of pieces of accountability, which of course for private philanthropy should be much, much lower than they should be for public or bilateral aid, for obvious reasons. So I think, there's an obvious low-hanging fruit, I think, for private philanthropy and public foundations to be able to lower those when you don't necessarily have the accountability to taxpayers' responsibility. But then there are some things that we learned from folks, including some of them on this panel. Through a consultation, we created a new category of grants, understanding that even though Co-Impact's sort of niche around projects that are ready to scale is our sort of area of expertise, many organizations were already serving sort of thousands, are ready to do that, but they just don't receive the funding. And there's a cyclical vicious circle, right, of kind of what recent graduates experience when they're applying for jobs, and they say, you need 5 years of experience, and they say, well, how am I going to get it if nobody hires me? It's a little bit similar. There are organizations that are like, we're ready and we want to grow and we want to work at that scale, but we're never given the chance. So we created those grants. All of our grants include organizational strengthening. Women's and feminist funds know that this is critical to the sustainability of the organizations. If the organizations don't survive, the work doesn't survive. And we need organizations that are healthy. And we've lowered some of the barriers. I think Co-Impact the work we fund is really complex. And so some of our applications were really complex, and we're working to be able to lower some of those entry barriers. Again, understanding that there's a particular niche in that continuum that we can't change. That's sort of our special sauce, but that we certainly can lower the barriers. But there's still challenges, and I think there's a lot that we can still do. I think on the collection part is one where, to Jess's point, Co-Impact in a way acts as a filter because we pool funds. And so once we have donors on board, their funding systems change, and we don't have strategies. We let our program partners decide what those are. So once the funders have signed on, it's a sort of a filter to be able to protect program partners from donors who tend to be a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of determining what the strategy should be or not. But I think the challenge for us is, you know, some of the donors that already are funding gender equality, they're already funding it. We want to get new money in. And the challenge is, how do we get that new money in with the nuances that we know are necessary to fund this work? And I think to Jess's point, I do think that there's a need to create some sort of space where funders who are sort of interested or have understood that funding gender equality is key, I would argue, for any program or strategy that you have, but that there's a need to do it in a particular way. And I think the spaces that exist today are not the appropriate ones, because there are spaces that are needed for sort of the feminist discussions, where I think bringing these other discussions aren't helpful, because those discussions need to happen in a safe space. But I also think that there are discussions that are missing on the other side of philanthropy, where there's some nudging that needs to happen, but in a patient way, where we really, as Jess said, meet partners where they're at, meet philanthropists where they're at, and help them sort of in that learning journey, without necessarily compromising the key pieces that are needed for the work, but at the same time being able to understand that, you know, there's a learning curve, and we need to be able to meet them where they're at. But again, I don't think we have any solutions. And Jess's point, I think, is key. I think collaborating and peer learning spaces are really important. I will say one more thing, which is Joy knows this very well. Peer learning takes time. And one of the things that nobody on this call, I'm sure, has is extra time. So I think a huge challenge that we have is, given the scale of the problem that we're trying to solve and the amount of work that, let alone we have, the partners that they're supporting have, how do we create the space and the time to be able to have these important discussions beyond spaces like this really important panel? Like, what is the follow-up, and how do we create that space? And that, to me, is one of the questions that I keep sort of rolling around in my head, because there's so many things that I need to clone myself to be able to do properly. And I really think that those are some of the key questions that we need to tackle, because, as Jess said, they're systemic. And if we can crack that nut, or begin to crack that nut, then the other things will follow.
Thank you. Thanks, Alfonsina and Jess. And I think, you know, what Jess said is so on point, as well as and Alfonsina. This is not a new conversation. It's not that we don't have the data. It's not that we are not cognizant of these kind of big picture issues around sexism and racism. And you know, there's so much evidence to speak to the need, right? And Jabilsile, I just want to give you a chance to respond to some of what's been said, and maybe share a little bit about what you're working on at the moment that you're really excited about, that you think is going to create a real shift on some of the issues that we've been talking about. And yeah, just close us out, really.
Yeah, so I think there's an aspect of the conversation that maybe we're not surfacing, which is that the systems that are in place that are preventing feminist movements from progressing are of themselves as well very racialized, right? And so, if I can use the Black feminist as an example, we have raised in our first year 35 million rands of our 100 million $35 million. I'm sorry, I'm South African. $35 million of the $100 million goal, right? But in that, we haven't been, we're not an exception in the sense that we haven't been accepted from experiencing the same type of discrimination that our movement face when they are applying for this funding, right? And so I think it's important to just like reiterate and remind ourselves that it's a systemic problem that does have a particular flavor or harm to Black feminists and gender expansive people. And then in terms of what I'm excited about, I'm really, really excited about this journey that we're starting with our new grantees. As I said earlier, we have given grants to 21 grantees that we'll be working with for the next 8 years, and that's super exciting for us. Really excited about the response that we're getting to the open letter, as well as research that we've done, which is called Where is the Money for Black Feminist Movements? And I think that is such an important labor of love that is written in ways that are not reductive, that are not extractive, and it really articulates the issues in ways that own the narrative, where people who have experienced this are owning the narrative. So I'm really, really excited about that. And I look forward to all of you reading it. Please keep an eye for it in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insights and expertise. And I don't know if anyone has had a chance to look in the chat, but there are so many of you are sharing resources, the new report from AWID on gender impact investing. There's a link to the open call letter from Black Feminist Fund. I know that Joy, there's a report from Prospera on 5-year trends that I don't know if Lauren or yourself would be able to put the link in the chat for that. Jess just shared a link, so thank you so much. I want to give a quick opportunity for Erica to share her screen and show the kind of visual result of the conversation. But certainly we'll be sharing follow-up email, and you'll be able to catch this on Women in Dev on the YouTube channel. And Paula will be putting a feedback form in the chat, so anyone can tell us more of what they'd like to see. So look out for that as well. And Erica is sharing her screen. Erica, I don't know if you want to walk us through this a little bit, but it looks amazing so far.
I'll just share that there's more. There's definitely more for me to fill in. So if you don't see something that maybe you heard was important, I'm going to be re-listening to this and looking at the notes. So hopefully you'll see it when you actually get the final copy. And I actually will just give you some quiet space if you want to take it in, because there's a lot. So thank you. Thanks for it was really nice to draw for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll leave this up on the screen as everyone is going, just so that you can continue to look at it before you head off. But thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to the panelists. This is our final installment of the Tapestry series, and I think it was a really nice way to end the collection of conversations that we've had, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of these types of conversations, just going back to what Alfonsina said about creating more space to have these kinds of conversations and really create some solutions to the problem. So thank you everyone, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you. Bye.